Welcome to a journey into one of history's darkest chapters. Using advanced AI technology, we have transformed medieval manuscripts, woodcut illustrations, and historical accounts into photorealistic scenes. Today, you won't just hear about the first week after the Black Death arrived. You will see it. You will walk the emptied streets of a European city in October 1347, stand in doorways where families vanished overnight, and witness the 7 days that separated the world. People knew from the world they would never recognize again. The first thing the survivors noticed was the quiet. In the autumn of 1347, a port city that had roared with life just days earlier now stood unnaturally still. The usual morning sounds, cartwheels on cobblestone, vendors shouting prices, the rhythmic hammering from the blacksmith's quarter, had stopped. The air hung heavy, thick with something the living couldn't yet name. Those who remained moved through the streets like ghosts themselves. They walked close to the walls, avoiding the centers of alleyways where bodies still lay where they had fallen. Some were neighbors, some were strangers, most were already unrecognizable, their faces darkened, their bodies twisted in final agony. The sickness had moved through the district in less than a week. It began with a single merchant vessel that docked on a Tuesday morning. The crew was dead or dying, but the harbor master had already collected his fees. The rats came ashore on mooring ropes, disappearing into the grain warehouses along the wharf. By Friday, the first cases appeared. A dock worker, then his wife, then the family living in the room above theirs. By Sunday, the church bells had stopped ringing, not because the priests had decided to stop, but because there was no one left to pull the ropes. Now, 7 days later, the survivors stood at their windows and tried to count who remained. A city of 15,000 had been reduced by a third, but the dying had not stopped. It had only paused, like a predator resting between kills. The markets were empty. The bakeries were cold. In the wealthier quarters, servants had fled, leaving their masters to fend for themselves in houses they had never learned to operate. In the poorer districts, entire buildings stood silent, their doors marked with crude crosses, warnings painted by hands that were no longer living. This was the first week, and the city did not yet understand that this was only the beginning. The survivors were not the strongest. They were simply the ones still standing. In the quarter near the cathedral, a wool merchant named Thomas moved through his house in a daze. His wife had died on the 3rd day, his 2 sons on the 5th. His daughter, the youngest, barely 8 years old, had lasted until dawn this morning. He had wrapped her in the bedsheet she died in because there was no one left to help him prepare her properly. The city's social structure had collapsed with remarkable speed. The magistrates who enforced order were dead or had fled to country estates. The physicians who should have stayed had been among the first to leave. They understood, better than most, that their knowledge was useless against this. Those who remained fell into 2 groups. The first were those trapped by circumstance, too poor to flee, too sick to travel, or bound by responsibilities they could not abandon. The second were those who had nowhere else to go. Servants whose masters had died, children who had become orphans in a matter of days. The elderly, who had already survived one plague decades ago and had decided this was simply how their story would end. In the Jewish quarter, the situation was different, but no less desperate. The sickness had struck them just as hard, but they could not leave. The city gates were watched. Rumors had already begun. Whispers in the Christian districts that the wells had been poisoned, that the plague was not a natural disaster, but a deliberate act. The few community leaders who remained alive understood what was coming. They had seen this pattern before, in other cities, during other disasters. When people could not understand their suffering, they searched for someone to blame. Some of the survivors tried to maintain normalcy. A baker in the eastern quarter woke each morning and lit his ovens, even though he had no apprentice to help him, and almost no customers. He baked bread because it was what he knew. Because if he stopped, he would have to confront the silence of his own house. In the wealthier homes, the servants who had stayed found themselves in a strange new world. They slept in their masters' beds. They ate from the good plates. Social hierarchies had dissolved in less than a week. But the comfort this brought was hollow. Outside, in the narrow streets, the city waited. The plague had not left. It had simply paused to gather strength. The bodies could not stay where they were. This was the cold, practical reality that the city faced on the fourth day. In the early hours of the plague, families had buried their own. They followed the rituals, washing the bodies, wrapping them in shrouds, carrying them to the churchyard with prayers and tears. But by the end of the first week, the churchyard was full. The consecrated ground surrounding the cathedral had space for perhaps 200 graves under normal circumstances. In 6 days, more than 4,000 people had died. The gravediggers, those who had not yet fallen sick themselves, worked in shifts that blurred together. They dug until their hands bled, until the cemetery looked like a battlefield. The earth churned and soft. Then they ran out of space entirely. The church faced an impossible question. What do you do with the dead when there is no more holy ground? The priests who remained, and there were fewer each day, made a decision that would have been unthinkable a week earlier. They authorized the digging of plague pits outside the city walls in unconsecrated earth. These were not graves. They were trenches, 20 feet long and deep enough that the living would not have to see what was placed inside. The bodies were brought by cart, stacked without ceremony, and covered with lime to slow the decay. There were no markers, no prayers. The priests who supervised these burials worked quickly, their faces wrapped in cloth soaked in vinegar, their eyes averted. In the wealthier quarters, some families refused to send their dead to the pits. They kept the bodies in their homes, waiting for the plague to pass so they could bury their loved ones properly. But the heat of early autumn did not cooperate. Within 2 days, the smell made entire streets uninhabitable. The city appointed men, criminals mostly, offered pardons in exchange for the work, to collect the abandoned dead. They moved through the districts at night, pulling corpses from doorways and alleyways, loading them onto carts that creaked under the weight. The sound of those wheels on stone became the new rhythm of the city after dark. By the end of the first week, the plague pits were already half full, and the dying had not slowed. The city was beginning to understand a terrible truth. There would not be enough earth to hold them all. By the 5th day, the city gates were choked with people trying to leave. They came in waves. First the wealthy, in carriages loaded with trunks and household goods, their servants running ahead to clear the road. Then the merchants, on horseback, carrying what gold and silver they could fit in saddlebags. Finally the poor, on foot, carrying children and bundles of cloth that held everything they owned. The guards stationed at the gates faced an impossible task. Their orders were clear: maintain control, prevent panic, stop the spread of the disease. But how do you stop a tide of terrified people when you yourself are just as frightened? Some guards abandoned their posts entirely, joining the exodus. Others stayed, but their enforcement was selective. A well-placed coin could buy passage. A family with visible signs of sickness, fever, the telltale swellings, was turned away at sword point, forced back into the maze of streets they had tried to escape. Those who made it through. The gates believed they were heading toward safety. They scattered in every direction, to the countryside, to neighboring towns, to family estates they hadn't visited in years. What they didn't realize was that they were carrying the plague with them. The disease traveled in the folds of their clothing, in the fleas nestled in the seams of their baggage, in the bodies of those who looked healthy but were already infected. By the end of the week, the roads leading out of the city had become vectors of contagion, spreading the sickness to villages that had never heard of the plague. The countryside was not prepared. Small farming communities had no physicians, no organized response, no understanding of what was coming. When the refugees arrived, begging for shelter, many were welcomed. It was an act of Christian charity that would cost thousands of lives. Some villages tried to protect themselves. They blocked the roads with felled trees and posted men with weapons to turn away travelers. But the plague did not need roads. It moved through the landscape like water, finding every crack, every opening, every moment of weakness. Back in the city, those who could not leave, or who chose to stay, watched the gates with a mixture of envy and resentment. The social contract had broken. The wealthy, who had always promised to lead in times of crisis, had fled. The city was left to the poor, the sick, and the faithful. By the 6th day, the exodus had slowed, not because people stopped trying to leave, but because there were fewer people left to go. The church had always been the city's anchor in times of suffering. But in the first week of the plague, that anchor began to drag. On the second day, the cathedral had been full. People packed the aisles, shoulder to shoulder, their voices rising in desperate prayer. They begged for deliverance, for mercy, for some sign that God had not abandoned them. The priests led processions through the streets, carrying relics and holy water, blessing doorways and marking foreheads with ash. By the seventh day, the cathedral was nearly empty. It wasn't that the people had lost their faith, not yet. It was that the priests themselves were dying. The clergy, who moved constantly between the sick and the healthy, who administered last rites in plague houses and heard confessions from the dying, were among the most exposed. Their robes, their hands, their very presence became conduits for the disease they were trying to pray away. The bishop had fallen ill on the fourth day. His death on the sixth sent a wave of terror through the remaining faithful. If a man of God, a shepherd of souls, could be struck down so easily, what hope did ordinary sinners have? Some priests stayed. They moved through the devastated quarters with a quiet determination, offering what comfort they could. They held the hands of the dying. They prayed over bodies that no one else would touch. Many of them knew they were walking toward their own deaths, but they could not reconcile abandoning their flock with the vows they had taken. Others fled. They slipped out of the city in the night, disguised in common clothes, their clerical robes left behind in empty rectories. The people who had trusted them, who had confessed their sins and sought their guidance, woke to find the churches locked and the altars cold. In the absence of official clergy, a different kind of faith emerged. Self-appointed preachers stood on street corners, declaring that the plague was divine punishment for humanity's sins, for greed, for lust, for the corruption of the church itself. Some called for public penance. Others claimed that only through suffering could salvation be found. In one district, a group of men began to flagellate themselves in the square, their backs bloody, their voices hoarse with prayer. They believed that by taking suffering onto themselves, they could appease God's wrath and save the city. The plague paid no attention to their sacrifice. By the end of the first week, half of them were dead. On the morning of the eighth day, the city woke to a realization that would define the rest of the century. This was not going to stop. 7 days earlier, when the first bodies appeared in the harbor district, people had told themselves this was temporary, a brief outbreak, a punishment that would pass once the guilty were identified and justice served. They had believed that if they prayed hard enough, fled fast enough, or isolated themselves carefully enough, they could wait it out. But the eighth day brought no relief. The plague pits were deeper, the streets were quieter, and the pattern had become undeniable. This was not an event. It was a transformation. The city that existed a week ago was gone. Not just physically, though entire neighborhoods now stood abandoned, but structurally. The agreements that held society together, that the church would provide guidance, that the wealthy would provide leadership, that the law would provide order, had dissolved like morning fog. In their place, something stranger emerged. Neighbors who had never spoken began sharing food. Strangers organized themselves into burial crews without waiting for official sanction. A glassmaker turned his workshop into a makeshift hospital, not because anyone asked him to, but because the building next to his was full of dying children, and he could not ignore their cries. The survivors of the first week were not heroes. Most of them would not survive the second. But they had discovered something fundamental about human nature that would echo through the centuries. When every structure fails, people either abandon each other entirely or hold on with a desperation that borders on defiance. The wealthy who fled would return months later to find their properties looted, their contracts worthless, their authority questioned. The church would rebuild, but it would never again command the unquestioned faith it held 7 days earlier. The certainties of the old world, that position meant protection. That piety meant safety. That the natural order was stable, had been exposed as illusions. In 1 week, the plague had killed thousands. But its deeper work was not in the bodies it took. It was in the assumptions it shattered. A merchant stood in the doorway of his empty shop, looking at the street where he had lived his entire life. Everything looked the same. The stones, the buildings, the cathedral rising in the distance. But he knew, with a certainty he could not explain, that he was staring at a different world. The plague had 7 days to introduce itself. It would have years to finish its work.